on Channel 5. This is the 10 o'clock news with Deborah Norville.
Is coming out revealing secret negotiation between the Nazis and the Zionists in 1933, which allowed German Jews and their assets to go to Palestine. Rich Samuels joins us tonight with the story of the controversy behind the book and the author's struggle to write it. Rich?
Deborah, with the rise of Adolf Hitler to power in the spring of 1933, the Jews of the world were faced with a dilemma. They could raise a cry of protest, a cry few would heed, or they could make a deal with Hitler, a deal that would bring a step closer their dream of an independent Jewish state. The choice they made was difficult and agonizing. This new book describes that choice. The book is called The Transfer Agreement. This is Israel a few days ago, the season of Passover. And this is Germany 51 years ago, the blossoming of Adolf Hitler's springtime. A key factor in the vitality of today's Israel, the book's author argues, was an agreement reached in 1933 between a group of Zionists and the man who would later try to kill every living Jew.
The great irony is that Adolf Hitler became the chief economic sponsor of the State of Israel.
Edwin Black, to fill the void left by the silence of his parents, has written this book, a dense, detailed chronicle of the early months of 1933. January 30th, 1933, Hitler becomes Germany's interim chancellor. The Third Reich has begun. But in this country, on March 4th, attention is diverted by the inauguration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
More power to you, President Roosevelt. The entire country's behind you, thrilled with hope and patriotism.
But ominous headlines tell what's already happening to the Jews of Germany. The protest of American Jews was heard almost immediately. It was based on only the sparsest of press reports, and nowhere was that protest more vocal than here in New York City.
All creeds, local and national organizations, and labor parties are joining this gigantic demonstration passing through famous Washington Arch. Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, honorary president of the American Jewish Congress, leads the procession down Fifth Avenue on foot.
Father arranged for the first great mass meeting at Madison Square Garden to protest Hitlerism. He felt that when freedom was threatened, silence condoned oppression always.
Thousands who waited hours behind police lines rushed forward as the doors of Madison Square Garden are open. Jews and Gentiles join in the race for seats, and 22,000 of them get in.
I was a young kid then, you see, as a teenager. And I belonged to a Zionist youth group. And we were all summoned to go to that rally. Well, it was a very agitated crowd. Many Yiddish speaking, a few English speaking. Rabbi Wise mounted an appeal to the Jewish people to do something to save Jewish honor.
Most of the important, well-established Jews were very angry at him, said this was sensationalism, and that if anything happened to the Jews in Germany, the blood of the Jews would be on his head.
Dr. Stephen S. Wise, rabbi of the Free Synagogue and a national leader of liberal thought, speaks in behalf of the Jews of the United States.
This is not a Jewish meeting. This is the conscience of America making itself felt.
The conscience of Nazi Germany made itself felt 5 days later. Across the Reich, Hitler's troops shut down Jewish-owned businesses for 24 hours. Within days, American Jews marched calling for the boycott of all German exports. Jews throughout Europe echoed that call, so did Jews everywhere. But a group of Zionists at the same time was quietly negotiating an agreement with the Nazis to allow the immigration of German Jews and the transfer of their assets to Palestine. That deal, reported in August 1933, was the transfer agreement. Palestine, sparsely settled by Jews at the time, was radically changed as a result.
I lived in Palestine from 1933 to 1936, and we saw every week transports of German Jews coming to settle in Palestine. Many new professions were introduced by them into the country, and they played a leading role in making Palestine then a more advanced and progressive country.
Israel is really what it is because of the foundation laid by the Eastern European group, and then the lift toward an educated and well-organized government that came with the immigration of the German Jewish group.
German Jewish settlement of Palestine was, for a time, official Nazi policy. These photos of Jewish life in Palestine, along with a lengthy text, appeared in 1934 in the Berlin paper Der Angriff. The publisher, Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels. A Nazi Visits Palestine was the title of the multi-part series. A medal was struck by Goebbels in commemoration. On one side, the swastika. On the other, the Star of David. Hitler demanded one concession for the transfer agreement, that the call for a boycott of the Reich, raised by Jews here and elsewhere, be rejected by the Zionists. The Zionists made that concession. And so, while Nazis were marching in Germany, and while Jews were marching here, diplomacy was running a more important story. In the Mediterranean, where the dream of a nation-state for Jewish people came a step closer to reality. The story in this book some will find hard to accept.
Did you find what you wanted to know?
Yes, I know what happened, and I know why.
The transfer agreement will be available shortly. Macmillan is the publisher. Deborah?
Thanks, Rich. Really interesting.
It led to a deal, the transfer agreement. That story on Chicago Tonight with John Calloway. Tonight, author Edwin Black, Rabbi Byron Sherwin of Spertus College of Judaica, and Rabbi William Frankel, past president of the Chicago Zionist Federation, discuss the transfer agreement controversy with host John Calloway.
Good evening and welcome to the program. And Edwin Black, thank you very much for being here this evening. Help me set the stage, if you would. If I understand, it's 1933. Your book centers on 1933. Hitler has just come to power. The German economy is in a terrible mess. It is really threatened by the prospect of a worldwide Jewish boycott because Hitler hasn't wasted any time going to work on the Jews inside Germany, punishing them in all sorts of ways. And then, as a result of this, and we're jumping way ahead, a deal is struck, which you call in your book the transfer agreement. Give us a capsule of what that was, and then we'll work our way backwards.
In exchange for the transfer of Jewish people and money from Germany to Palestine, the Zionists agreed to sabotage the boycott, which threatened to topple the Hitler regime in the first year.
So that it is a deal with the devil, in effect, and it divided badly the Jewish world.
A deal with the devil to save Jewish lives.
And to create a Jewish state, you're arguing.
To save more Jewish lives.
You're saying that's the first priority.
That's right.
Would a Jewish state, would the state of Israel exist if this deal hadn't gone through?
Without the continuing economic relationship between the Third Reich and the Zionist movement, it seems doubtful that there would be a state of Israel as we know it today.
And it is because the Germans, the Jews inside Germany, are being held hostage. 600,000 of them, in effect, are being held hostage in 1933, that Jewish leaders, the members of the Jewish Committee in the United States and other Jewish leaders around the world are saying, go easy on this notion of a boycott because you may enrage Hitler and you may see the punishment even worse. Was that not the governing factor against an immediate, total boycott?
That was the governing factor by those Jewish leaders in America who were of German descent. Those Jewish leaders who were of East European descent and or who represented an East European constituency, such as the American Jewish Congress, the Jewish War Veterans, felt that the only way to stop Hitler was an effective boycott, was to protest visibly, to isolate him diplomatically and economically, and that we could not stop just because there were threats of reprisals. They knew that by opposing the Tsar several years earlier, they had increased the attacks upon the Jewish hostages there, and at that time they said Jewish blood must be spilled in the war of liberty. But it's understandable how people could be fearful at that time for their own kith and kin living in Germany.
And the ironies are incredible in this story, because there was a deep relationship between the Jews in Germany and Germany as a nation. Germany, you write, had in effect saved the Jews in Palestine from annihilation from the Turks during World War I.
That's right.
There was this great love of Germany and the culture of Germany by many of the Jews. And while the deal was being made to get the German Jews to Palestine, the German Jews were the last Jews on earth who wanted to go to Palestine, anywhere else but Palestine.
That's right. The German Jews were one segment of the Jewish community which considered themselves anti-Zionist. They considered themselves 101% German. They were Germans who were by accident of birth of Jewish religion. Many of them were Reformed Jews, Jews of little identity, and the last place they would have gone to was Palestine. It is an extraordinary irony in one of the telling stories of the transfer agreement how an organization and a movement within Germany that represented just 1 or 2% of the community became the custodian of the entire...
Zionism only represented 1 or 2% of the Jewish population of 600,000 in Germany, you're saying?
According to its own best estimate.
Now you introduce a character named Sam Cohen, who is the deal maker, at least at the beginning. Could it be argued that this is another one of those incredible chapters where somebody's really out to do good and make profit and change the course of history?
That's exactly what the character of Sam Cohen is. This man was half devil and half deliverer, as he was called by his own associates and the people who knew him. He thought that by his own contrivances and intrigues, he could deliver the Jewish people to the Jewish homeland, and in the process turn small profits.
Now, to help us in this conversation about Edwin Black's book, The Transfer Agreement, I want to introduce Rabbi Byron Sherwin, Spertus College of Judaica, and Rabbi William Frankel, who was a past president of the Chicago Zionist Federation. And Rabbi Sherwin, if I understand correctly, you in part were influential in Edwin Black's writing of this book. How do you feel? Tell us that story and how you feel about it.
Well, it was in June of 1978. Edwin, who I didn't know at the time, called me regarding a story he was doing for the Sun-Times in connection with the Nazi march in Skokie. And the article had to do with anti-Semitism in America. In the course of our discussion, in response to one of his questions, I mentioned the transfer agreement. He responded by saying, such a thing couldn't have existed. It's impossible. A year and a half later, he called me back and he said, you remember you mentioned this thing called the transfer agreement. Was there really such a thing? I said, yes. He said, well, where can I find out about it? I said, it's documented in every one of the major histories of the Holocaust. There were at the time 4 major histories of the Holocaust, beginning with Poliakov's in 1954, down to...
Have you read the book?
I've read it through a number of its transmigrations in various manuscripts.
What's its value?
Its value is, I think, that it opens up an area of Holocaust studies, an area of Jewish history, an area of American Jewish history that has been kept very quiet.
Rabbi Frankel, how do you feel about this book?
Giving a picture of some kind of a sinister plot between the Zionists, whatever that means, and the Nazi government. When in fact it was, incidentally, as Rabbi Sherwin mentioned, this can be found in any encyclopedia. The Encyclopedia Judaica has an article on the subject. It's nothing sinister. It was an arrangement. The possibility that the boycott would actually topple the Hitler regime was a far-fetched possibility.
Now, I'm sorry to interrupt, but when you say it's not to be viewed as sinister, at the time, if we can believe Mr. Black's quotes and research, there were quite a number of persons who felt that it was doing business with the devil, right, and that it divided Jewish groups and Jewish individuals and non-Jews all over this world.
It did. It did.
So that the characterization of it as sinister is certainly...
Retrospectively, it did succeed in saving 60,000 German Jews and brought $40 million to Israel. And in fact, it did not do much for the German economy, because that money did never reach Germany. It was German goods which were exported to Israel with money of German Jews which would never have left Germany.
I have one last question before we go to phone calls, Mr. Black, and that is that you make a great deal. I think you're on record here and elsewhere as saying that this really was critical to the development, the eventual development of the State of Israel. And yet, if only, and maybe only isn't the word to use, 60,000 German Jews from 1933 to 1941 ended up in Palestine. And there are already 200,000 to start off with, and many hundreds of thousands would follow. Statistically, it doesn't sound like that's the... It sounds to me like you can make an argument that Israel would go on and become a state sooner or later anyway.
You're right. It's not the 60,000 German Jews that came over. It's the $50 to $100 million in assets that came over, which expanded the Palestinian economy, increased the general immigration quotas for East European Jews, that allowed hundreds of thousands of East European Jews to come in, escape the spreading Nazism of Europe.
We're talking, the term leveraging is what we're talking about here.
They built the country.
We need to make, I think, one more point clear, and that is that the British mandate charged, if you wanted to get out of Germany, you had to pay the equivalent of $5,000 or 1,000 pounds, wasn't it?
No.
You had to have
to enter Palestine.
To enter Palestine,
you needed 1,000 pounds, but you couldn't take 1,000 pounds out of Germany. I'd like to also mention that although the transfer agreement is cited as a fact in many Holocaust references, that's all it is. No one knows no one knew the details behind it. No one knew its relationship to the boycott.
So there's a lot of original reporting that went on here.
About 80 to 90% of it.
All right, now we have phone calls, and we'll go to them now. Good evening. You're on the air.
Hello?
Yes, go right ahead.
Yes, Mr. Calloway. I'd like to ask Mr. Black, what was the role of the British government in this transfer agreement, being the fact that Palestine at that time was a British mandate? Did the British have some part in the negotiations between Mr. Cohn and the Nazis?
The British were often go-betweens between the Zionist organization and the Nazi regime. They initially thought the transfer agreement was a great idea because they thought that British goods and services would abundantly supply the growing Palestinian economy. At the last minute, they found out that it would not be the British merchandise that would be purchased, but German merchandise, and then they decided to take a hands-off policy.
All right, we have another call. Good evening, you're on the air.
Yes, could you please tell me, I happen to be from Germany myself, and my family was quite Zionist already before World War I, and you stated that the German Jews were not identified at all with the Zionist cause, which I consider not completely true, because in Germany there were actually intellectual and sports organizations which were very identified with the Maccabier, which became then an official event even in Israel, and you claim that the German Jews never wanted to identify themselves with Herzl and the Zionist cause.
Well, that's a little overdrawn, is it not?
No, it's not. The most authoritative reference on German Zionism is the History of German Zionism by Richard Lichtheim, who was, of course, on the Zionist Executive Committee, who says nowhere among the world Jewish communities was Zionism more rejected than in Germany. The organizations to which you refer, the Maccabee Sports Organization, was a transcontinental organization which was indeed Zionist, but it fell under a special category known as non-Zionist, which was a contrivance of the German Zionists to control Palestine without becoming nationalistically involved.
Rabbi Frankel, you wanted to comment.
Well, I'm not of German birth, I'm Viennese. I was born in Vienna. I can tell you this, the Zionism was rather strong in Vienna. I'm aware there was strong opposition to Zionism in Germany. At the same time, the German Zionists made a major contribution later on to the upbuilding of Israel.
And that is reported on in the book. I mean, that is actually reported, but it was considered in some circles a sacrilege, was it not?
In some circles.
We have another caller. Good evening, you're on the air.
Should I talk now?
Yes, you should.
Oh, thank you. You see, I didn't know whether it was I'm wondering whether Mr. Black seriously considers the effect of a Jewish boycott being of such strength that it would affect Nazi Germany.
I'm glad you raised that question. I wondered if that part of the drama, and you really make it quite a narrative, isn't overplayed a bit.
Well, it's very simple. If Hitler did not think the boycott would overthrow the Third Reich, why would he help build the State of Israel?
Makes a great case for the premise of many of the Zionists being that Hitler was just the latest in a long line of oppressors, and that in some respects Hitler was a blessing because it says you've got to get on with making this state, otherwise you will run into Hitlers for the rest of existence.
That's quite true. Just about 10 years before, actually in 1919, most scholars don't know this, 100,000 Polish Jews were annihilated within the span of 18 to 24 months along the Polish to Russian border. A plan to ship en masse 600,000 Polish Jews to Palestine was abandoned because they knew that 200,000 would starve to death within a few months, and another 200,000 would be forced to re-emigrate elsewhere, and only 200,000 would be left. They could not accept these numbers. This time, the Zionists wanted to make sure there was a state to come to.
All right, let's go to another call. Good evening, you're on the air.
The Zionists wanted to know there was a state to come to, but also I think we're missing the point. The main point is that thousands of lives were saved, and whether there was an accommodation between the Zionists of Germany and the Nazis, or the world Zionists, really doesn't matter.
Sir, let me argue that some might argue that it does matter because the accommodation was made in the absence of what could have been a total boycott. Had the boycott been effective, Hitler could have been put out of business early, and the Holocaust could have been prevented. Mr. Black argues that's oversimplified, etc., but that can be an argument.
I agree with Mr. Black. It is an oversimplification, because you have to remember, 1933-34 was in the midst of a depression. The depression was not only in the United States, but it was worldwide.
Right.
Every country was looking for a market. Germany definitely wanted a market.
Right.
The United States probably has the largest overseas population, or had the largest overseas population of Germans.
And it had a president, Franklin Roosevelt, who was in no mood not to be nice to the Germans.